All right, we're ready to get started. I hope everyone can hear me well. Greetings to everyone who is joining us today for this for this session rather. My name is Janice Bithello. I am the Kenya Country Director for WUSC, World University Service of Canada, and I also serve as the Project Director for DREAM, which is the Displaced and Refugee Youth Enabling Environment Mechanism. This is a mouthful, and it is a project that we have that is based in Kenya and focuses on enhancing the inclusion of refugees and displaced young people across the continent. And certainly a project that would not be possible without the generous support of the Mastercard Foundation, a number of those colleagues who are present today. A very warm welcome to all of you joining from around the world, and we're very pleased to be able to share this research with you, which has been done in partnership with Expectation State, a wonderful firm that we have worked with, and are very pleased to share the findings of it and hope that it will inform a lot of the work that you are undertaking or experiencing going forward. A few logistical and household details that we'd like to share with you. We are in a webinar format, so all of you have been muted. However, should you wish to utilize interpretation for English and French, you will notice it is in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, so you will be able to access interpretation services there, with many thanks to our interpreters who are supporting us today for this event. We would really welcome you to introduce yourselves. We'd love to know who is here, and please let us know your name, where you're chiming in from, and how you're related to this work. So you'll see a chat function at the bottom of your screen. This is where you'll be able to share general comments or introductions. If you have specific questions that you'd like to ask any of the panelists, you'll notice a Q&A button as well at the bottom, so feel free to use that specifically for questions that you might have. If there are any other issues, please let us know. A number of my colleagues are on the line here. Chiatsa Pasipanojga, you'll see someone who also is under the account of the WUSC public events. Please do let us know if you're experiencing any particular issues. I would like to now turn over the mic to my colleague, Karen Meyer, who is the program lead for refugee and displaced persons with the Mastercard Foundation. And she'll speak a little bit about why this research has been important both for us at WUSC and at the foundation, and why we're doing it and how it'll inform our work going forward. Karen, over to you.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Janice. Really, I just want to say on behalf of the foundation to thank everyone for joining the session today. We're very pleased to share this study on the lead up to World Refugee Day, which is a day for the world to reflect and action inclusion and solutions for refugees. And we hope that this study is one such actionable contribution. Last year, the foundation was busy developing a strategy for how to reach and support refugees and displaced persons in Africa. And this was a challenging process because of the lack of data and evidence available, specifically in the West Central Africa region. And so we're very pleased to share this study as a public good so that beyond Mastercard Foundation, the findings can be visible for other funders and organizations to potentially build on the recommendations and create opportunities for displaced youth. At the foundation, under our Young Africa Work Strategy, we are working to enable 30 million young people to access dignified and fulfilling work by 2030. And we specifically invest in young Africans who have been forcibly displaced, including in their host communities. And we do this by enabling high quality education and training and supporting pathways to dignified and fulfilling work as employers, entrepreneurs, or job creators. We also work with a multitude of stakeholders across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, particularly young people themselves. And we do this to address systemic barriers that hinder the economic prospects of forcibly displaced youth. And this study is one such helpful guide in ways in which the foundation and others can enable inclusion and economic opportunities for refugees and displaced youth in the particular context that Expectation State will speak to. So with that, I wish to thank WUSC and Expectation State one more time for delivering the study and supporting the foundation, and hopefully others, and getting one step closer to impacting the lives of refugees, displaced persons, and their communities. Thank you. Back over to you, Janice.
Thank you so much, Karen, for setting the stage for us for this session ahead. Before I turn it over to the Expectation State team, I really would love to take a moment to acknowledge their efforts over the past few months in getting this study realized, particularly to the team of Raymond Asfour, Dr. Lucy Hubble, Amin Alouche, and also acknowledging the team of researchers who have been involved. And I'd like to thank Jibril Balde, Dr. John Steve Kabore, Ibrahim Saleh, Yakuba Sogore, and Amina Ben Abdallah. A huge thank you to this team for what was certainly an extensive endeavor to be able to provide the results of this study. And with that, I would love to turn it over to the Expectation State team. I'll start with Raymond Asfour, who is the CEO of Expectation State. I'll also bring online Dr. Lucy Hubble, who is a migration expert, and also Amin Alouche, who leads the work in North Africa and Francophone Africa for Expectation State. Over to you, team.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Janice, and thanks to everybody for both the warm welcomes and to those who set aside not insignificant time in your diary to come and hear a little bit about this research. Chetsa, if I could have the slide up, please, that would be really helpful. Thank you. We are really conscious that this is a huge issue. It's a huge issue in terms of the thematic, in terms of the scale, in terms of the numbers of geographies we're talking about around Central Sahel and West Africa. And what we want to do is, in a way, manage expectations for the report more than this session as to what can be covered in one single report. What we've tried to do is make a really meaningful dent, if you like, in terms of interrogating some of the issues we find, both from a regional and national context, but also from a global context, and really put down some practical recommendations and practical applications as to what can be done to ultimately improve economic opportunity for refugee and displaced youth and host communities along the Central Sahel. So our goal is to talk you through that. We're going to do that through around 9 or 10 separate slides. We don't want to do too much to overburden people, and we'd really, ask you to sit back and absorb, formulate questions, which we'd be really happy to engage in and respond to later. Ultimately, this will come back to a recommendation from us to absolutely engage with the report itself as much as possible, and we'd be really happy to have follow-up discussions with those of you that are interested. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Amin on the next slide to begin talking about the methodology and our approach. Amin, over to you.
Thank you, Karen and Janice, and thank you, Ray. And I will be doing the next session in French. So if you can need translation, you can switch that on. Merci, Janice. Merci, Karen. Merci à toutes les personnes ici présentes avec nous aujourd'hui. Comme présenté, je m'appelle Amin Alouche, associé à Expectation State et coordinateur des consultations pour ce travail que nous venons vous présenter aujourd'hui. Nous sommes en fait très heureux d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui pour présenter en fait les résultats de plus de 6 mois de recherche et d'environ 5 mois de consultation et d'entretien dans les pays focus de ce travail de recherche. Ça a été mené par 9 chercheurs en total, dont 3 sont présents aujourd'hui devant vous. Honnêtement, et pour faire court et laisser le temps à mes collègues d'entamer l'exposé dans son détail, je commencerai simplement par donner un petit aperçu sur l'approche méthodologique qui a mené à ce rapport, d'ailleurs que vous pouvez lire dans sa version longue sur le site web de WUSC et dans sa version abrégée. On a fait en sorte qu'il y ait une version plus courte. Nous avons évidemment commencé le travail avec une revue documentaire. On a couvert les documents d'orientation et de prise de position de la Fondation Mastercard. Nous avons essayé de couvrir les documents gouvernementaux, les communications intergouvernementales. On a fait une sorte d'analyse des portefeuilles des acteurs et de la documentation programmatique existante dans la région. Les études publiées par les organismes de recherche régionaux, la littérature académique et les publications aussi des groupes de réflexion, les fameux think tanks internationaux qui ont été tous revus avec un certain focus sur les travaux considérés comme ayant des méthodologies de recherche robustes. Donc nous avons essayé de choisir et de faire un focus sur la qualité. Et nous avons aussi privilégié honnêtement les travaux dont les chercheurs sont basés en Afrique de l'Ouest parce que nous pensons que c'est important pour la compréhension de la région. Évidemment, dans notre cas, en tant qu'entreprise, la recherche a beaucoup bénéficié de l'expérience cumulée de l'équipe. Nous avons mené des travaux sur des questions similaires en Afrique de l'Est, mais également en Jordanie et en Tunisie, et dans d'autres pays et régions du sud mondial. Donc, nous avons appliqué toutes ces leçons, un bon nombre de ces leçons qu'on a apprises au travers de notre travail. Puis, après cette revue documentaire, nous, avec l'aide d'un pool de 4 chercheurs basés respectivement au Sénégal, au Niger, au Burkina Faso et au Mali, nous avons pu organiser dans ces pays des consultations de plus de 60 personnes identifiées. Alors, ces personnes, elles se présentent elles-mêmes en tant que personnes déplacées, représentant leur expérience et leur vécu, mais représentent également des organisations et des agences pour lesquelles elles travaillent. Donc parlant d'une expérience de terrain ou une expérience académique. Ces dernières personnes, d'où viennent-elles? Elles viennent d'agences de développement, elles viennent du travail humanitaire, elles viennent du terrain, plus spécifiquement de travail sur le déplacement. Donc des chercheurs universitaires et des chercheurs indépendants et autres. Au total, avec l'interview de 8 autres personnes ayant une expérience régionale, donc en plus de l'expérience pays, nous avons atteint une merveilleuse base de données en fait de 70 personnes, ce qui nous a non seulement mené nos recherches, mais ça a apporté une sorte de perspective et une vérification de la réalité, ce qu'on appelle en anglais une reality check, à la recherche documentaire et à l'examen des documents avec lesquels nous avons commencé. Comme vous pouvez voir sur la diapositive, la répartition du pool peut être discutée. En termes de différence de genre, en termes de spread géographique, il était vraiment extrêmement difficile de contrôler complètement à qui nous pouvons parler. Par exemple, dans certains pays comme le Niger, nous avons eu du mal à parler aux personnes déplacées vivant dans et autour des camps de réfugiés ou dans des zones d'accueil des personnes déplacées, notamment pour des raisons de risques liés au contexte social et intercommunautaire, risques sécuritaires et autres, bien évidemment. Ces défis sont bel et bien développés dans le rapport. Vous l'avez probablement déjà vu, mais vous pouvez le consulter également. Après cette phase de consultation, donc il y a la revue documentaire, les consultations. Après cette phase de consultation, nous avons procédé à l'analyse de toutes ces données. Je dirais juste 2 mots ici et je passe la parole à ma collègue Lucie. L'objectif de l'analyse n'était pas seulement de fournir des recommandations programmatiques, ce qui peut être l'objectif de l'étude, d'une façon tout à fait légitime. Mais on a essayé d'aller un peu plus loin pour fournir un cadre général menant à identifier les points d'entrée sur les opportunités économiques et éducatives également, parce que c'est un focus indépendant de l'étude pour ces populations déplacées. Mais encore une fois, non seulement pour les populations déplacées, mais également pour les communautés d'accueil. Donc c'est un travail général qui présente des points d'entrée pour les personnes déplacées et leur communauté d'accueil. Je passe maintenant la parole à Dr Lucy Ovel pour nous emmener à travers le contexte de déplacement où cette recherche a eu lieu. Dr Lucy va continuer en anglais en cas où vous avez besoin de traduction. Over to you, Lucy.
Thanks very much. And thank you, yes, to all of you for coming today. It's really great to have this opportunity to present. And I'm just going to set the scene a bit by giving some context that will help us think about the links between movement and economic opportunity. And I think it's helpful to think about 3 different strands in relation to this. First of all, migration has always played an important economic role in people's lives in West Africa, whether as a means to generate trade and income or as part of a strategy to cope with poverty and drought. And although this might sound a bit obvious, it's important, I think, to recognise that movement has always been an intrinsic component to livelihoods. But secondly, alongside this history of migration, there's been one of growing restrictions on movement. And in particular, colonialism created a big increase in the regulation of movement because it effectively put borders in place where they hadn't been in place before. And of course, while some of these borders remained relatively porous, others were far more controlled. And the point here really is that this put restrictions on people's movement, which then had an impact on economic opportunity because the two go hand in hand. And then running alongside this is a third strand, which is a history of forced migration in the region. And not only was West Africa the site of the biggest displacement of people out of the continent through the transatlantic slave trade, but colonialism also created significant micro displacement within the region. So a lot of different populations were forced to move to work on plantations or mines or in construction or as part of military recruitment. And these layers of forced movement then continued after independence as the result of a number of conflicts, including civil wars in Liberia, Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire. And most recently, there's been a growing displacement crisis in the Mali Niger Burkina Faso tri-border area, known collectively as the Central Sahel, that's been driven by a combination of violent extremism, poor governance, and the growing impact of climate change. And as a result of this, millions are fleeing either within their own countries as internally displaced persons or across borders as asylum seekers and refugees. And this crisis is really undermining many of the hard-won political and economic gains that the region has made over the past decades. And it's had a major impact on livelihoods that were already fragile. And it's putting a huge strain on weak basic social services. And I think our findings shows that this has particularly hit a youth population that then becomes vulnerable to recruitment into organised crime or violent extremism, in part because of the lack of job opportunities. You can see the numbers on the slide, but the key point here really is that the scale is considerable and the trajectory is unfortunately only getting worse. So let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Chetsa. So from a policy perspective, it's really important to place this discussion, first of all, within a global context, because global approaches to refugees inevitably have a big impact on national responses. So a key challenge when we're thinking about economic opportunities for displaced populations is that refugees have for a very long time been seen really as a short-term problem rather than as a long-term opportunity. And there are plenty of reasons for this. It's partly linked to the fact that repatriation, as one of the three official durable solutions for refugees, is often seen as the only option. And that's been the only possibility for most refugees. And what this means is that integration into the area in which a person has been displaced has often been out of reach for many refugees, which has created a lot of ongoing humanitarian emergencies. That's not to say that refugees don't manage to create livelihoods for themselves outside of the policy environment, but they haven't been helped by it. And this has not only jeopardized the quality of life for displaced populations, it's also led to a lot of wasted potential for host populations that then bear the brunt of hosting refugees, but without seeing any of the benefits. And while at a rhetorical level and globally, there has been some commitment with initiatives such as the Global Compacts to operationalize what is called the humanitarian development nexus in responses to forced migration, which in part recognizes the economic potential of refugees. Unfortunately, putting this into practice has been a different matter. There's been a lot of talk and not very much action. And partly, in a way, this is because for refugees to engage in economic activity, they need a sufficient level of economic inclusion in the host country or local community where they're living. And economic inclusion demands political will and economic investment. But refugee integration remains a term that's really fraught with social and political sensitivity, and the political capital that is needed is often in short supply. So thinking about West Africa now, at a global level, while there is this sort of general state of inertia, if you like, in responding to long-term displacement situations, the West Africa policy context becomes quite interesting. In particular, economic integration in the region holds a lot of potential because countries in the Central Sahel all belong to the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, which a lot of you will be familiar with. And this was established in 1975, precisely to strengthen economic integration through the free movement of goods, capital, and people. And what this means is that in theory, there is a really strong enabling environment for people to move freely, that first category of movement, if you like, that we talked about in the previous slide, and therefore for economic inclusion at a policy level. The catch, however, is that its impact on displaced populations remains somewhat ambiguous. While states in West Africa have generally opened their borders to large numbers of refugees, they've then fallen short of offering genuine local integration in the form of a new citizenship when those refugees have been forced to stay for more than a few months into decades often. And they still encounter significant difficulties as a result, moving around the region, so that they're subject to, for instance, informal taxes or arbitrary detention. And so that's not to say that significant progress hasn't been made, but it does create a bit of a contradictory policy environment when it comes to the inclusion of refugee populations. And layered on top of this is the fact that refugee policy in West Africa has been very much skewed by the misframing of the region by European states as primarily one of irregular outward migration to Europe. And this is not only wrong, because the number who try to move to Europe is a fraction of overall movement, but it's put the focus onto the few who migrate out of West Africa rather than on investment in refugee and host populations within the region. So in practice, this means there's been a lot of investment in, for instance, border management and so-called development programs designed to stop potential migrants from traveling to Europe, rather than investing in sustainable approaches to hosting displaced populations. So just to end this slide, what does this mean specifically for the Central Sahel? Well, first, I think it's really important to remember that we've learned the lesson, or we should have learned the lesson, that today's crises often become tomorrow's protracted situation. So yes, Central Sahel is a fast-changing humanitarian crisis right now, but it's important to build longer-term thinking into any response to that situation. Secondly, the ECOWAS framework certainly provides opportunities for economic integration, but it's also worth remembering that the lack of government control over large parts of Central Sahel, along with what we found as a significant deficit in credibility of governance, has really undervalued its potential in that bit of the region. And finally, in sort of bringing these two together, issues such as documentation do still remain significant as a means to economic inclusion in the absence of governments being willing to offer a new citizenship to long-term displaced populations. So I'm going to hand back over to Raymond now, who's going to take us through the next few slides. Thanks, Ray, over to you.
Thank you, Lucy. So what we're going to do now is delve into the economic context and set the scene a little bit. And I think it's worth us remembering that first we have to look at the economic context across the countries that we're looking at, and then delve into what that means for refugee and displaced populations themselves. And I'm going to talk us through a couple of facts, a couple of slides, a couple of these graphics to really get to grips with this issue. First of all, I think it's really important to highlight just the sheer size that we're talking about of economies, but also populations critically. So the combined size of Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger's economies is roughly equivalent to that of Jordan. So picking another geography that clearly has a large displaced community that they're hosting. But the difference here is that Central Sahel has approximately 7 times the population of Jordan. So it gives you a real sense of the scale from a human perspective of displacement, but also host populations that are being dealt with. And another big, let's call it a difficulty when it comes to addressing economic issues in the Central Sahel, is the level to which the informal economy is prevalent. So that's the economy that does not go through formal economic measures, that is not necessarily regulated and governed and critically tax collected by government. So that can really range from as low as 20% in urban areas to right down to 1% in some rural areas of Burkina Faso. So really what we're talking about are economies which are overwhelmingly informal in the certainly in the rural sense. And that echoes a point that Lucy made earlier regarding just how limited at times governments' reach is across the territories of these countries. So we can talk about policy frameworks, we can talk about regulatory frameworks, we can talk about national economic plans, but ultimately that is predicated upon a necessity for government to be able to reach and access and have effect at times, which is not always the case. It's also worth highlighting, and it's this this graph in the bottom left, the issue of employment and unemployment, when you look at the typical unemployment levels across the Central Sahel, they seem relatively low, but that's often because unemployment is really about individuals who are looking for work and can't find it. It doesn't record what is termed underemployment or vulnerable employment. And those are individuals who are being productive, but are ultimately not in orthodox employment. And these are staggeringly high in some places across the Central Sahel, right up to 92% of the population in Niger. So it gives us an idea of the reality of economic opportunity, not just for refugee and displaced populations, but for the populations of inhabitants of each of the countries we're looking at. I think it's important to consider this context as well in terms of population growth. So the central figure here, the central graphic here of 2 to 4%, looking at population growth rates a few years ago, really shows an area in the Central Sahel which is significantly above average, particularly in the case of Niger, in terms of population growth rates. If we twin that with the fact that Africa will need to produce across the continent 2 million jobs per month by 2040 to keep up with population growth, we start to see the real issue here when it comes to increasing members of the population requiring increasing number of jobs or increasing economic opportunity to be economically active. So that's a staggering both opportunity and a challenge. This was certainly an opportunity when it came to similar trends in the latter half of the 20th century in East Asia. It's the case for Africa now, where we have large growing populations which are, requiring jobs ultimately as individuals reach the age of entering the workforce. So a challenge and an opportunity in and of itself. What we also need to pay attention to are what we call externalities. So the things that, come out from develop over time, whether slow burn or imminent crises that could potentially affect productivity across the region. The graph in the bottom right, which is comparing each individual country in Africa as a region, is highlighting productivity loss, so share of GDP lost as a result of heat stress. So really we're tying this to climate change and how, as a result of increasing temperatures, West Africa as a region is going to be one of the worst affected in terms of lower levels of productivity of the workforce. And at an individual level, that results in perhaps people losing jobs or less efficient, less effective workforce. But at a national and international level, that has a direct result on GDP growth. It has a direct result on the productivity loss of the country and the growth of the economy as a whole. So there's a huge amount for us to really get our teeth into and grapple with there. And I think the key thing we have to recognize is that when we're looking at the economic context as it pertains to refugee and displaced populations, we're often not talking about a huge difference between members of indigenous communities, of host communities who are equally suffering from huge lacks of opportunity from an economic standpoint. And I think that leaves us needing to take quite a sober assessment of the context we're working in. I think given vulnerable employment to population growth to relative stagnation of the private sector, we're looking at a working assumption that has to be that wide-scale unemployment and lack of economic opportunity isn't necessarily going to change in the Central Sahel in the short to medium term. And that needs to be a starting point where we accept that in order to come up with credible and likely effective interventions, whether policy related or programmatic or otherwise. If I could have the next slide, please. Excellent. So it's helpful, I think, at this stage to also look at, how do states typically react to that sort of economic context, and what does that mean for refugee and displaced populations? Well, a lot of the time what you'll hear from ministers, from governments, not just across Africa, but across a huge number of states that are seeking to catalyze economic growth, is that actually what they want to do is draw in greater levels of investment. The more foreign direct investment that can come in, the more there's fuel to the economy, the more the economy will grow and jobs will be created. And while that's true from a technical perspective, it's very important, I think, to look at scale and trajectory. At present, direct investment into Africa over the last 5 years has created less than 1 job for every 100 job seekers. So around 0.7% of jobs required. And that's direct investment. So even if we were to add indirect investment, the growth of certain value chains, even if we were to multiply that number by 10, we're still talking about, you know, a trend which clearly shows that investment is not a silver bullet towards growing an economy and growing jobs for young job seekers coming into the job market. And it's really important, I think, that we bear that in mind whenever we're looking at a policy perspective, particularly at a national level. So what does that mean? Where are there entry points? One of the things I wanted to highlight down at the bottom is really an appetite for entrepreneurship. You know, the vast majority of the size and the enterprises within the economies we're talking about are ultimately micro and small enterprises. So very small businesses that are either, you know, employing an individual or a few other people. And that's the makeup of the economies of the Central Sahel, as with so many other economies that we deal with day to day. And it's important, therefore, within that context to, I think, understand appetite for individuals to, if we like, at a decentralized level, want to engage in the workforce on their own terms. And that's around this issue of entrepreneurship. And in an African youth survey that stretched across 14 countries not too long ago, 76% of African youth surveyed would like to start a business in the next 5 years. And if given a hypothetical $100, 50% of African youth surveyed would use it to start a business. Now, clearly, these are generalizations across, you know, multiple geographies, multiple countries to extrapolate, you know, across a continent, which isn't necessarily particularly accurate. But I think it quantifies to a level what we really both find in our consultations, but also know from work elsewhere, that entrepreneurship, you know, is a critical driver of the economy, that there's an appetite and a desire for people to do that. And that's also, you know, not simply a rational decision individuals are making in terms of their earning potential, but really they are, I think, seeing an aspect of hope in an ability to self-determine, if you like, their economic future through entrepreneurship. So, you know, these are all points that I've highlighted that we have very much shaped our approach to this work, our approach in terms of the analysis and the findings and the recommendations which come out of it, which we're going to come on to later in this proposal. I think, lastly, it's worth touching upon what that means in terms of, if you like, continuing on with the paths that are already in existence for refugees and displaced youth to enter the workforce. How do we do that? And a couple of points here for us to consider. One is that, you know, pathways that refugees and displaced youth are already using into the workforce are ones we should double down upon and support rather than trying to reinvent. Two, how can we look at better formalizing displaced individuals? So currently working within the informal economy, but potentially migrating into a more formal economic standing. And there's a lot of complications to that and risks, but one to look into. And lastly, this issue of entrepreneurship. How do we equip and enable displaced individuals to take their economic destiny, if we like, into their own hands? And that will be principally through entrepreneurship. So all in all, it's an incredibly difficult economic context. It's an economic context where there isn't a huge difference between host communities and refugee and displaced youth and their populations. And so as a result, it's not simply an issue of those displaced populations, but an economic issue across the region as a whole. And what we want to do is begin to frame economic contribution or economic opportunity for refugee and displaced populations as part of that solution. So as part of how they can contribute towards growing economies, not seen as a threat to other individuals who are looking for jobs or economic opportunity in the region. And we'll certainly come on to that when it comes to recommendations. If I could have the next slide, please, Chetza. Fantastic. So the issue of education is clearly central to the Mastercard Foundation's work, and it's clearly of interest, you know, for youth, not just across the Central Sahel, but across the majority of the countries that we're all living and working in. I think it's worth highlighting a few statistics, if we like, around education and documenting and articulating some of the challenges that we came across when engaging on education throughout the study, and then we can extrapolate some findings from that. So a few things to begin with. Only 12% of children are both enrolled in school and able to read and comprehend at an age-appropriate level by late primary school. So, you know, a really stark statistic there, which again is a bit of a cautionary tale, or gives us a warning against this idea of simply viewing enrollment in school as a solution. So when kids are enrolled, they're getting educated, not necessarily the case. This secondary enrollment is just 5% for rural girls, and up to 100% in urban boys in the wealthiest sections of society. So really pronounced gender and rural-urban divides there when it comes to education, which are important to note. It's also, I think, absolutely worth drawing this issue around only 6% of refugee youth accessing higher education globally, compared to 37% of youth globally. And in Central Sahel, this figure could be as low as 1% anecdotally, although we don't have hard evidence for those statistics. So what we're talking about is a real minority of youth who are looking to pursue into higher education. So that's post-secondary school education. It's important for us to go back to that issue of, well, what's the standard, if you like, within the countries we're talking about? Because in Niger, that figure is probably 3 to 4% anyway for Nigerian youth. So again, yes, significantly bigger in multiple times than that 1%, but still, seriously underperforming, if you like, in terms of youth who are going into higher education. Why? What are the challenges to that? Well, for applicants, there are a number of them. For refugee and displaced applicants, one is documentation. So less documentation allowing them to enroll in education societies, but the administrative burden around that. Can they find accommodation? Can they benefit from bursaries, any sort of financing that's available, and just generally running into administrative burdens with host governments in terms of their permissiveness of them engaging fully as university students. To the cost, it's expensive, and mostly there isn't discrimination between different nationalities, although there is in 1 or 2 countries. But also it's the opportunity cost. What else does that family have to spend money on that is not the education for their young person who's completed secondary school? And secondly, priorities. There are priorities outside of getting to class, which is either families are on the move, survival, working, issues to do with being able to earn enough money to support the family in the evenings, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot to consider, and it can't simply be boiled down to this issue of enrollment. Then on institutions, this is the individual education establishments themselves. Geographic coverages. These are huge countries where individuals are ultimately having to travel long distances to attend university, which means that they can't go home in the evenings, or can't necessarily go home at weekends, which adds to cost. Infrastructure, chronic underinvestment in education infrastructure, teaching, and the recruitment of teachers who perhaps are not simply going on strike because of issues to do with salary payments, but are also unwilling to work in areas where government remit, security does not stretch to. They're simply not willing to staff schools or universities where they feel like their security isn't a given, isn't guaranteed. And lastly, a key point we'll touch on later is curriculum. The sense that there is a little bit of a disconnect between the curriculum of what is being taught on courses to university students and what the workforce and potential employers actually require. And I think this is all neatly summarized in this graphic in the bottom left, which is around new graduates. So what it's telling us is that new graduates every year leave university and don't find jobs. So what happens is we have a pool of existing unemployed graduates from previous years who still haven't found jobs. And that number of unemployed graduates is growing. It's growing and growing and growing because there aren't enough jobs within national economies to support them. So we're creating a bottleneck where, in a way, the graduate jobs market is perhaps remaining fairly stagnant, or certainly not growing in line with the graduates that are graduating. And also, public sector jobs sought after, but governments are trying not to continue to grow their public sector wage bill. We get this little bit of a trap, if you like. And there's a really interesting set of statistics from Burkina Faso, which tells us that more than a third of young people with higher education are unemployed. So around 34% of graduates are unemployed, compared to 17% of secondary school students and 11% of primary school students. So we see this inverse proportionality, if you like, of qualifications versus actually being able to find work at that level. So it really brings us to ask really difficult questions, I think, of this idea that actually simply putting more graduates through university is the answer, more economic opportunity. There simply aren't the jobs within the national economies there to supply those graduates with meaningful work at a level they're qualified for, and a level they rightly aspire to, having put in a lot of hard work and money to get to. And I think there's some really interesting statistics there on the slide, but also interesting statistics and quotes in the report as a whole, and I'd recommend that you delve into them if that's of interest to you. Next slide, please, Chetsa. Great. So what we're going to do now is run through really the recommendations that we came to as a result of this piece of work. You know, as Amin mentioned, this was a 5-month piece of work in terms of the research with researchers in each of the countries that we're working in. And even what was a fairly substantial research effort, which collected some really interesting data, we can never begin to represent all of that or in any way be proportionate of the views. But what this told us, as well as our own desk research and our expertise, was that there are a number of potential entry points that could be undertaken, whether by the Mastercard Foundation, other organizations or entities in the region, that should be explored. Our job in this study was to identify those entry points, not to design them and fully test them, but to identify where those entry points could be. So to begin with, I'm going to pass over to Amin to break it up from a speech perspective. He's going to talk us through a few of these and then pass over to Lucy and myself. Amin, over to you.
Thank you, Ray. Alors, notre première recommandation générale, basée sur ce que Ray vient d'exposer, est vraiment liée au fait que la recommandation principale préconise des actions visant à accroître le champ du possible en quelque sorte. C'est le champ du possible en termes d'opportunités économiques. Nous savons déjà que 90% du tissu économique en Afrique est composé de petites et moyennes entreprises, voire de micro-entreprises. Une enquête également sur la jeunesse africaine, menée, je pense, sur 14 pays du continent, a révélé que 76% de la jeunesse africaine voudrait créer un business dans les prochaines 5 années. Donc, on demandait aux gens, est-ce que vous avez envie de créer une entreprise, un business dans les 5 prochaines années? 76% ont répondu par oui. Hypothétiquement, si on donnait $100 à un jeune Africain, il y aurait 50% de chances que cette personne l'utilise pour créer une entreprise ou commencer un business. Donc, quand on a demandé, il y a 50% de jeunes Africains qui ont répondu qu'ils utiliseraient ça, pas pour acheter des fringues, mais vraiment pour acheter l'opportunité de créer une entreprise. La première recommandation est d'essayer d'accroître le potentiel disponible chez les personnes déplacées à l'opportunité économique. Là, encore une fois, nous ne parlons pas de création d'emplois ou de postes d'emploi ou de fourniture d'investissement uniquement. Ceci peut disparaître en fait lorsque les individus et les communautés doivent à nouveau se déplacer, soit par la force des choses, soit pour poursuivre un voyage initial de déplacement vers une destination finale qui peut être différente de la géographie d'intervention. Donc l'objectif ici est de doter les individus, les personnes, les familles, les groupes, les communautés de compétences qui leur permettront de créer des emplois pour eux-mêmes et leur communauté là où ils peuvent s'installer, où qu'ils s'installent. Nous pensons qu'il est important d'accepter le fait que les déplacés soient en mouvement. Ça change un peu avec d'autres doctrines, mais si nous partons de cette idée que les personnes déplacées peuvent être encore en déplacement pour une bonne période de leur vie. Donc, il est important de travailler dans la durée, de proposer de la formation pour ces personnes, d'accroître leur potentiel. Nous pensons qu'il est également important de travailler avec et à travers les structures familiales et sociales déjà établies, pour essayer de détecter du potentiel dans ces structures et de travailler sur ce potentiel préexistant. Il est également important de s'appuyer sur les compétences préexistantes, essayer de développer. Nous avons rencontré dans les consultations des compréhensions telle sorte que quelques communautés ou quelques familles peuvent venir dans la géographie d'intervention avec des connaissances bien spécifiques et avec des qualités professionnelles bien spécifiques qu'on peut développer davantage. La deuxième recommandation est qu'on a appelée ici formalisation de l'informel. Il s'agit ici de faire avec les réalités existantes, encore une fois. Il ne s'agit pas d'essayer de changer les choses d'une façon drastique, mais de travailler à travers ce qui existe. Nous pouvons observer des tendances de communautés effectuant déjà des travaux dans des secteurs sans protection sociale, sans protection juridique, ou même sans protection physique pour les personnes qui fournissent ce travail. Généralement, les autorités locales je dirais même régionales et internationales, vont détourner le regard ou poursuivre les employeurs et les travailleurs irréguliers, d'ailleurs généralement les travailleurs, pas vraiment les employeurs, juridiquement et par la police. Donc nous pensons qu'il est possible de changer le discours autour de cette question et de pousser les gouvernements et les programmes qui existent à accepter cette réalité, à travailler avec cette réalité en créant des voies pour passer de l'informel au formel, pour formaliser ce qui a toujours été informel. Là, nous parlons de secteurs comme l'aide domestique, comme la vente de rue. Je suis basé en Tunisie moi-même et je vois que c'est des secteurs qui existent et qui sont pratiqués par des personnes déplacées. Nous parlons également de transport, des taxis ou d'autres formes de transport. Et la liste est vraiment longue. Donc, pour faire court, encore une fois, il est possible d'amener les personnes plus proches à l'économie formelle pour plus de sécurité. Cela profiterait au pays d'accueil, accroître son économie, aux communautés déplacées, aux communautés d'accueil et aux personnes et à tout l'ensemble de cette structure. Je passe la parole, next slide please, et je passe la parole à Lucie.
Thanks very much. There was just one more on the previous slide, sorry, Chedza, which was about the importance of documentation and particularly for children and young people who are trying to access education, needing this records of previous learning. And of course, if you want to get records of previous learning, that's often linked to wider documentation issues. So right back to issues such as birth certificates, marriage certificates, all of these other forms of documentation remain incredibly important. And I think that while there's definitely been some progress in West Africa, for instance, with the work around ending statelessness and some of the sort of related work that UNHCR has been doing there are a lot of issues that still remain in terms of displaced populations being able to access the right documentation. And one way of working on this is through using paralegals who can help people access the point at which they are needing to access those records. So that's going on to the next slide then. Thanks, Chedza. So yeah, I think the next point is really this idea that to work with, and I think we keep trying to make this point in different ways, but working with refugee, displaced and host community-led organisations or people who, they are the ones who best know what their needs are and what can be most helpful for them. And I think we're so slow as outside actors, if you like, to realise this point and actually put it into practice. And I think it's a real shame, and it's such a great thing to see that there are a number of people who are refugees on this call. And thank you so much for joining us, because your viewpoints are so important. And I think this idea that we need to work with refugee and community-led organisations, it's been talked about so much at an international, global level in, in hotel rooms, but we need to put it into practice. And I think there's a lot of potential there, and it's great that the Mastercard Foundation are really committed to working with these local organisations. And not to also just to emphasize the fact it's both refugee and displaced communities, but also the host communities they're living amongst. So I'm going to hand back to Ray now.
Thanks, Lucy. So the point here I think that's worth tackling is related to an approach to higher education that moves the needle. Earlier, when we looked at higher education and university enrollments and the prospects of graduates when they left university, it becomes clear really that simply funneling more students into university isn't necessarily an answer in and of itself, because they're by no means guaranteed a job when they leave university. And we looked at ways in which we could potentially put in place a different approach or come up with different ways in which we could move that needle. One was to conduct the labour market analysis, to work with universities to update the curriculum as a result. So this is really identifying again that challenge which I talked about earlier, of the curriculum not necessarily being suitable for the workforce as they exit. Finding yes, they have a degree, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were taught exactly what was required. So We don't know if anybody who's going out there right now working with private sector companies, identifying the kind of macro skills necessary for graduates moving into the workforce and feeding that back into curriculum development within universities. It feels like there's a real dislocation there and something that could be done. Expanding or investing in already established online universities providing higher education. Since 2020 and COVID, and again, testament to this session being held over Zoom, there's been a real proliferation of organizations and also individuals who are keen to engage virtually, so engage remotely, whether through work or with education. And that's a really powerful tool for individuals who are quite geographically displaced and not necessarily able to access universities in their area, but also to bring down the price point for those students who want to engage in education following secondary school. So there's a role here, I think, to be played in working with online universities to provide higher education for West and Central Africa as a region. And I think it's important we look regionally and potentially beyond internationally. So what are the jobs that individuals, both host communities and refugee and displaced youth, could be undertaking remotely, could be getting prepared for remotely, that online universities could be preparing them for, both at a lower price point and less of an emphasis on being geographically displaced beside universities. So there's a lot to be said, I think, for really digging into that and backing and supporting online universities as they grow in the region. So on to point F, building the case for economic inclusion in the region, again, a really critical one. Often when we talk about displaced populations, there's a huge amount of sensitivity from a government perspective, from a political perspective, from a community perspective around this issue of integration. But in a way, we can set that to one side and we can look at this issue of economic inclusion. So how can individuals who are displaced become net economic contributors to the countries that they're staying in? I think first and foremost, we really need to begin to build a bit of a research capability, a robust research base, if you like, for that. The research was incredibly scant that we were looking at across Central Sahel. So what we would say is any practical programmatic step being taken should ideally be twinned with a research capability. Secondly, I think it's really important to highlight the potential for contributions by displaced persons into the economies, nationally, regionally, and elsewise. So really what we want to be able to do is demonstrate, practically speaking, where individuals who are displaced, have been displaced, have become contributors to the economy. And critically, and this is, I think, an important one at a human level, not to quote unquote prove their worth, but just to demonstrate and change the argument and discussion around economic inclusion. And that could be through working with incubators or organizations that are either working for, in, with host communities or refugee or displaced populations, and beginning to really, if you like, highlight those. Lastly, there is an increasing movement in impact investment towards this issue of refugee lens investment. So moving money to grow ecosystems, to grow enterprises that are serving displaced populations. That's something which individuals could absolutely be looking into. There are a number of impact investment collectives that are interested in refugee lens investment, and there's a growing field there, which is worth looking at. Point G, I think a really, really important one that we're touching upon last, but we shouldn't forget, is economic opportunity is not all about having a job. It's not that you have opportunity if you have a job and that's it. There's a lot more to it. In some cases, it's around access to finance. In some cases, it's around ability to bank. In some cases, it's around being able to, use some credit for 6 months. So we really can't forget that in a quest for jobs. And one way in which we think that can be done is supporting fintech, financial technology startups that could potentially see a customer base in populations across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Perhaps they're focused on other geographies around West Africa, some of the larger, more mature economies like Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Ghana. But by working with them to potentially expand their offering into the Central Sahel, we can open up, if you like, a customer base beyond them. And that could be around e-banking, telephone banking. It could be around access to different financial services. There's a whole lot of potential there that should be explored. Secondly, microfinance plays a key role. It absolutely does in a huge number of geographies across the world, not least, of course, East Africa. But really being able to leverage the power of entrepreneurship within displaced communities to come up with mechanisms where individuals who want to start businesses, who want to start their own small enterprises, have the finance to be able to do that in a way which is responsible and also realistic for individual organizations that are lending money and ultimately need to recoup that capital. And lastly, the local banking sector has a real role to play. And very often we find banking sectors that are extraordinarily risk averse, not interested in engaging with SMEs, don't really want to make it particularly easy for you to open a bank account and engage if you're a pretty low level operator. But actually, the more they can be incentivized to put in place offerings for SMEs who are active or employing in areas of high concentrations of displaced people, the more we can really draw benefit from that access to finance landscape. So we've gone through a huge amount of ground there in terms of recommendations. You know, I've said it before, I'll say it again, these are clearly more nuanced and expanded within the overall report, but hopefully that gives you an idea of where we were thinking in terms of practical steps from the research. Jets, if I could have the slide, please. So last slide here, I guess really what I want to say is that, yes, there's a large in-depth report, and a few of the comments I've asked for these individual slides. These slides were drawn from a shorter communications document which we put together, which is perhaps 12 or 13 pages, which takes a very large, voluminous report and boils it down into something a lot more digestible for individuals who don't necessarily want to spend hours pouring through a report, but want to get into it more. I'm sure WUSC colleagues will be able to follow up in terms of when that will be published. The main report is going to be in French and English, and links have been posted already. The shorter communications document is a much more accessible way to engage. I guess this leaves it from a presentational perspective to say thank you so much for engaging. Really looking forward to your questions, and after going through the report, please do feel free to reach out to us to discuss any of this further should you wish to. Thanks. Back to you, Janice.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the Expectations team, to Raymond, to Lucy, and to Amin as well. I see a number of questions that have come up in the question and answer box, and we can start to go through them. With respect to the slides and the recording as well, we will make all of this available on our website. There will be a short blog post that will be going up that will share the link to the full report, a link to this particular recording, slides if people wish to have them, and the summary as well. So you'll have a variety of opportunities to digest this information in a variety of formats as well. So perhaps we can go right into some of the questions here. Folks, please do keep them coming as you've been able to sort of listen and reflect on some of the findings that have come about as a result of this research. The first is from Alex, who has mentioned that he's a refugee in Uganda. He says, wow, this research is very powerful. However, you also have to talk about Uganda because it is also the first in Africa for a number of refugees. I mean, I think they have so many challenges about economic opportunities. And maybe what I can do is sort of weave in an additional question around that particular piece there, which is that, as we know, we are absolutely saturated with information, data, and initiatives and programming that occur in the East Africa region in particular. While Alex rightly notes there are still a number of challenges that occur for refugees to access economic opportunities. What would you say are some of the points of caution, perhaps, that both funders, donors, and even programmers such as WUSC need to take into account when they have a significant amount of experience working in a space such as East Africa that may not necessarily apply in the Central Sahel, for an example? Maybe Lucy, I can come to you there.
Thanks, Janice. Yes, I mean, Uganda certainly is a really challenging environment. On the one hand, it has shifted significantly over the last couple of decades in terms of the policy environment. There are lots of political reasons for that. But I think that the things that haven't shifted in Uganda are really around a couple of things. One is that I don't feel like the international community, if there's such a thing exists, has really committed to the kind of long-term sustainable funding that actually is demanded by this. And I think this comes back to this wider policy environment where constantly refugees are seen as a short-term, if you like, problem rather than as a long-term issue that needs to be really grappled with. And I think that still remains a problem. And although there's definitely a sort of policy shift at a global level towards that, I don't think it's really reaching the ground at a sufficient level at the moment. And that has all kinds of implications around sort of really bringing in local government, bringing in other actors. But I think when you think about then, I think, yes, there's always dangers about extrapolating from one context to another. I think that what's very striking about Central Sahel is the extent to which it's still got that kind of immediacy of being a humanitarian crisis, if you like, because people are, you know, still fleeing. It's still a very, very fast changing situation. But then at the same time, that has been layered on to lots of very systemic long-term issues that remain unaddressed. So it's not as if everything should now just shift into emergency humanitarian response mode and all of the other sort of factors that existed before suddenly get ignored, if you like. And I think balancing those two is really, really hard. And I think this is why we need to be so much more savvy with going for approaches that are grassroots up rather than top down, because at the end of the day, people will figure out how to build mobility and migration, whether it's forced or otherwise, into their livelihood structures and into their aspirations. But they can't do it if they're constantly having a whole lot of policy ideas, if you like, imposed from above. And so I think it really just comes down to this sort of grassroots idea of working with what is going on and building up from there rather than the other way around. I could say so much more, but I won't get distracted too much. But thank you, Alex, for that question.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lucy. And thank you, Alex, for that question. I'll come next to Angèle Messa, who has a couple of questions. The first one is, did you consider the impact of language and cultural barriers on refugees, barriers to access to higher education and opportunities? And the second question is, did you find any correlation between the level of education and employability outcomes for refugees as well?
Sure. So I'm happy to tackle these. Thank you so much for the question. So impacts of language, broadly speaking, we were told that actually there were not huge impacts of language in terms of acceptance onto courses. The exception here was with Nigerians who were ultimately English speaking, trying to enter a French education system at university level. But I think what was lost in translation a little bit is ultimately the soft approach to language. It's one thing, isn't it, to say you can engage and enroll in French. It's another thing to say you completely understand everything and are able to turn in written work that's of a sufficient standard. And it's funny, we found the similar soft barriers when it came to issues of ethnicity, cultural barriers less so, but ethnicity, where almost universally we were told by respondents, no, not a huge ethnicity problem when it comes to us accessing education. And that was seen as not really an issue or much of a barrier. But then we also had individuals saying, no, at a structural level, nothing stops us from getting into university. But ultimately, if an attitude of a teacher is that they don't particularly like you because they're not a huge fan of your ethnicity, your background, your nationality, then that does become an issue for you. It's also, I think, really relevant from a gender perspective as well. So are there any hard structural reasons as to why individuals of different genders can't enroll in university? No, not that we found, not that was told to us. But are there things that are inhibiting women from enrolling? Absolutely. Hugely, from social pressure to family to early marriage to et cetera, et cetera. So there's just such a discrepancy between something that's structural and something that's, you know, actually happening in practice. On the second question, I can't answer that specifically to outcomes for refugees, but more broadly within youth who are graduating university and graduates, yeah, I would say it's less about employability and more about employment. So is there a correlation between level of education and employment? Anecdotally, yes. Anecdotally, it seems that the less employment you have, the more likely you are to find a job because you're looking for a job at a certain level and there are more jobs at that level. Perhaps more tasks that don't require particularly heightened skills or education. And what we found interestingly was both through our interviews and a couple of key documents was that there isn't an attitude or an appetite to say, well, I can't work, so therefore I will drop down to do a job that's below my station from an education perspective. People thought, listen, and rightly so in a way, as I would too. I've done all this hard work, I've got my degree, I'm now educated in this, and I need to have a job which is commensurate to that. And as a result, a lot of frustration which went with it. So yes, we did find that it affected employment. The statistics are simply not there from a refugee-specific perspective. Partly because this is such a live crisis. You know, this isn't a protracted crisis of 20 years where people have been in commissioning data sets and commissioning studies. There's still a lot of movement going on. Thank you.
Wonderful. Was there anything Lucy or Amin wanted to add to Raymond's response? Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much, Angel, for your questions. I'll come to Gareth next, who says, knowing that you've mentioned in the host environment is not well developed for refugees in the Central Sahel, did you come across secondary school enrollment and completion statistics amongst refugees and youth living in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali? And for those refugees who complete their secondary education in the Central Sahel, are there university scholarships offered by, say, Mastercard Foundation or UNHCR that they can access? Well, we can certainly help answer that, but we'll come to the expectation state team first.
So I'm happy to tackle this one again and then hand over to WUSC. I think the short answer is no. Solid statistics were incredibly difficult and often very contradictory, which meant that a lot of our analysis had to come from multiple statistical sources, and then ultimately taking at times an anecdotal assessment of what is and what is the case in some of the countries that we're talking about. So we don't have those hard statistics, but what we can absolutely do afterwards is, in fact, you can see it in the report, share a lot of the sources that we used if and where that would be helpful. I think I'll pass over to Janice for the question with regard to scholarships. I will just add that the complexity of it is, yes, there's a need for scholarships in individuals to maximize their potential. And there's also a need for us to hold that in tension with the fact that more graduates will run into less jobs in the private sector, which is a demand issue, if you like, rather than a supply issue. But I'll pass back to you, Janice.
Thank you, Ray. So Gareth, just to say that, yes, indeed, there are opportunities available, namely under the Mastercard Foundation's Scholars Program, which broadly has a target of 25,000 scholarships that are dedicated towards those who have a background of displacement. In fact, a number of those universities are actually part of this call at this moment. I see Lynette Aguko, who is from USIU. I see individuals who are from 2IE as well, and from ALU, I believe, as well. There are a couple of participants. So you'll see that it is something that's of particular interest to a number of universities who are already Scholars Program partners. And yes, there is active work that's occurring to reach out to students from across the continent. But certainly more work, I think, needs to happen in terms of targeted and specific outreach to those who are in the Francophone region specifically. Thank you, Gareth, for that question. And now we'll come into another question from Chegun Koba. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. How do you take into account the pastoralist youth and their economic needs in the Central Sahel?
I'm happy to take this one. I think that we didn't look specifically at pastoralist youth, but I think that it's really interesting because a lot of the challenges that they face, particularly where you have nomadic populations that are de facto or de jure stateless, can be quite similar to displaced populations. And I think one of the key things I'd say is that political marginalization and socioeconomic marginalization often go hand in hand. And if we try to separate those things out, it's not very helpful. And I think that bringing people in, if you like, from the margins politically is an incredibly important first step. And I know that there has been some work done on this in Central Sahel, but obviously not nearly enough. And I think this does leave pastoralist youth particularly vulnerable, while it would be really unhelpful to draw a parallel with recruitment into violent extremism and organized crime. I think it would be also naive to think that that doesn't exist purely as a result of circumstance, but then that becomes a vicious cycle. So the more that association is made, the more marginalized people become as a result of it. So I think the short answer is that it's an incredibly important issue, and it's one that we weren't able to pay significant attention to. But there are some really striking similarities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There is a question that appeared in the chat box in French, and the question is, what aspects of refugee vulnerability did the study take into account, focusing on their access to opportunities around natural resources, such as land?
I wonder if, is it worth you reflecting on that from a land perspective?
Yeah, possible, not necessarily to, I don't think I have an answer to the question directly, but it was one of the areas that was mentioned quite a number of times in the consultations, specifically when spoken to displaced persons themselves, where it's clear that across the board in the 4 countries, land is a big issue from a cultural perspective, but also from a legal perspective. So that's one to be aware of, and that's one that I think we didn't cover directly when speaking about working with the reality of the geographical reality and with the professional reality of the beneficiaries of any programming. So it's one, and I remember discussing this while we were working on the job, on the research. It's one where there would be much needed communications from the government or from the organizations that work in these areas to sort of make peace with this question between host communities and incoming communities. And there are big intersections with violent extremism and with border control as well, which need to be looked at. But it's one issue that is at the heart of the conflict that might exist socially between host communities and displaced communities. I don't think that answers directly the question, but that's the context that we found related to this question.
Wonderful, thank you. And there was another question that came up towards the end. I want to make sure that we're sort of tackling some of the questions that are specifically about this piece of research, and then I can come back to some of the other questions that have broader implications for the continent as a whole. So those who have questions for other particular reasons, hang on to them, and we'll come to them towards the end. There was a question towards the end that asked, here we're talking specifically about employment opportunities. What can be done upstream to avoid conflict situations that lead to displacement and the lack of socioeconomic integration difficulties in host communities as well?
Lucy, would you like to tackle upstream?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important question. And I think we get so caught up in the weeds of understanding the emergency that's happened that we sometimes don't take that step back to ask that question. And I think it's really important. And I think, yeah, absolutely, we should be constantly thinking about those systemic issues that are going to drive future tensions and future conflicts. And I think keeping a very, very clear eye on what's going on around some of the stresses as a result of climate change right now is absolutely fundamental, because I think that we don't want to be caught napping on this. And I think there's plenty of data to indicate. I think it's always dangerous to draw straight lines, if you like, between certain factors and drivers of conflict, because conflict is always driven by multiple factors and is always, if you like, quite messy in what leads to it. But I think it's really important that there is sufficient investment, in understanding some of these key drivers. And I think it does come back to this idea of the fact that investment needs to be always being seen as long-term, and where it just becomes purely palliative, it will always be short-term and limited in its impact in terms of some of these drivers. Ray, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, ideally the time to work on, if you like, the safety net or the coordination required to make life easier for displaced populations is when there's no displacement, which is a bit trite because clearly there's not going to be no displacement, but prior to crisis. What you need to do that is you need some sort of multilateral framework or super international framework, which you can see states agree on different policies and enact them. In West Africa, you have that in the ECOWAS states and the ECOWAS framework. And ideally, what you'd want to see is, yes, there are issues around freedom of movement and the ability for individuals to move freely, but there are the reality of administrative hurdles once you do that. There's a reality of what that really means. So, how can a lot of these issues, for me, one of them is the acceptance of different forms of documentation in different countries and what's required, from records of previous learning to identity documents and so on, that can be done in slower time, so that when these things do happen, you're not having to enact hurried policy and procedural changes at a time of acute crisis. And it's about, that's in a way not simply preparing for the upstream of trying to mitigate conflict happening and displacement happening, while of course it's exceptionally important, but also preparing for, if it does happen, you're not starting from scratch in terms of dealing with large swathes of moving communities.
Super. Thank you so much. And now the remaining list of questions have taken on a little bit more of kind of a regional or a generalized tone around specific challenges that refugees with different disabilities face, but also there are questions around some of the economic and financial opportunities that displaced young people face in other parts of the African continent. I see some questions from Malawi. There are some questions from Southern Africa as well. I suppose what I can do is kind of combine all of them together and sort of get your final reflections around this. What are some commonalities that you've seen across the region in terms of the types of challenges that refugees and displaced communities are facing? You've talked about access to finance. You've talked about access to sustained economic opportunities as well. What are some of the common elements, other common elements that you're seeing that warrant a little bit more of a blanket response, perhaps, to how some of these issues may be tackled? Or perhaps is that not possible at all? Is there a much more of a contextual response that's required?
I'm happy to start and then I can pass over to others. I think one thing that's really important to flag is that if we equip individuals to ultimately make better of themselves and their situation in the places they're in, the risk is we ask them to start again from zero if they decide or need to move again. So how do we equip individuals either with skills themselves or assets in terms of small businesses or otherwise, which are ultimately mobile, which are ultimately can be taken elsewhere, whether that's skill related, trade related, otherwise. Because the danger is, we have an individual who or a family which comes in or a community which comes in and is in place for 6 months, and we say, okay, what's the wraparound? How do we link them to this specific market next door? How do we engage them in this particular sector of the economy? And then they end up moving across a border into another economy. So I think it's acceptance of working with movement, not in spite of it or against it. The reality is we have to continue to allow ourselves to support organizations. I think this is the key point we shouldn't let go of. When I talk about us, what ultimately we're talking about is ideally supporting local civil society and helping the delivery of local civil society to support those organizations, to support those communities as they do continue to move. From an economic perspective, it's really, really difficult. But once an individual has the ability and desire to start a small business, they're probably going to carry that with them and certainly the fire of that with them as and when they move. And I do think it's really difficult one to touch back on, but access to finance is critical. The ability to start a business is contingent upon having a little bit of money to start that business. How do you do that? Is it national-based microfinance? Is it regional approach to microfinance? Is it some sort of online financial technology solution which is backed up by a multilateral agency? I don't know, but individuals need fuel to start endeavors like that. And ultimately, as much as we can come up with these bright ideas, that's best enabled and enacted through local civil society.
Yeah, I mean, I would just back up that point. We should stop working against movement and start supporting it because it's so inefficient to do otherwise. And I think that is maybe the most important point, overarching point, which you put much better than I did, Ray. So,
and to even insist even more and take it outside of the discussion right here, this exactly this what Ray and Lucy were saying was mentioned in the context of not only economic enablement, but also in humanitarian work. I just from memory, at least 3 people, regional experts working on displacement in both in East and in West Africa, mentioned that there's the gap in programmatic humanitarian and economic empowerment work where we can make people more independent and help people gain the skills, the money, yes, but also the skills they need to be independent.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And now perhaps as a final question and, a bit of a reflection in the final months as we march towards the Global Refugee Forum in December in Geneva, there are a number of individuals who are participating in this call who will be there and, who are thinking about what this work in this particular region might mean for their organizations and some of the areas that they work in. Based on your experience of the research over the past 5, 6, 7 months, what particular reflections would you like them to leave with as they look towards events such as the GRF in particular for this region? What are some fundamental pieces of insight you think and areas of priority that should be focused on for the Central Sahel?
I mean, I think just to start by saying it's never helpful to compare places particularly, but it was incredibly striking, as we've said, that there is a real dearth of really good research and information from West Africa in terms of what's going on. And I think that that's really important, whereas Uganda probably has the opposite problem, where refugees can hardly get on with their day-to-day lives because they're having researchers pestering them to do interviews. It's the opposite problem in West Africa. I don't think either is great, but I think that would be maybe one of the key things. It's just we need to get some really good, robust information on the region.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to come in with two. One related to the region and one perhaps slightly broader. I think the key thing that I'd want to get across from an economic perspective is we can't decouple the idea of economic opportunity for refugee and displaced populations in host communities from the reality of, you know, the national economy, issues around employment, levels of vulnerable employment. You can't manufacture economic opportunity in a context where actually everyone's finding it difficult. And it's just to be aware that that is very different from Jordan, from Uganda, from Kenya, and each country is clearly unique. And each region is clearly unique, but we're talking about some areas, some rural areas of these countries that are among the most deprived that we're going to find from a resource perspective. And I think that's something to really bear in mind in terms of a benchmark. The second point, which is perhaps slightly more global in its application than related specifically to the Central Sahel, is something we're quite passionate about is reframing the discussion around migration and economic opportunity. To begin to depoliticize and desensitize it away from this idea of, oh goodness, you know, integration is a really dangerous thing. There's cultural issues, there are legal issues, people are going to take jobs and etc. Right? We begin to build a bit of an argument, a bit of momentum behind this idea that displaced individuals can become net economic contributors. They can contribute towards richer, more diverse economies, and there's a decent amount of literature to support that. From foreign direct investment linked with diaspora to trade with cross-border trade being increased as a result of populations that have been on the move. And I think it's incumbent upon us to begin to turn the narrative on its head a little bit, to begin to talk about where we can, and the evidence base is already scant for this globally, but where we can, where there's those little bright lights to shine of saying, actually, we can identify this as a bit of an opportunity from an economic perspective handled correctly. If we want to marginalize displaced populations or put them in camps or pretend they don't exist or cause, of course, it's going to be a problem. If we can actually see them as ultimately individuals with latent economic potential that can be unlocked in complementarity with those communities, not easily done, clearly, but it changes the debate, it changes the discussion of what exactly we're trying to do. So that's probably the point I would leave with.
That's a great note to end on, and a wonderful call to action, I think, for all of us in the variety of ways in which we work in this space as well. We've come towards the end of our session here. As I have the mic, I'd like to take this opportunity on a very personal level to really thank the Expectation State team for their work on this over the past few months. It has been a real privilege and pleasure for WUSC to partner with you on this research and really to expand our own understanding and horizon of what this, what seemingly is a bleak landscape, but is also one of opportunity in other ways as well. And we thank you for opening our eyes to this and in the work that we'll continue to do going ahead. Of course, we continue to remain grateful to the Mastercard Foundation for their support in allowing us to do this work and for also making this type of research a public good for everyone to be able to access and to be able to inform their own work for the present and for the future. And finally, a huge thanks to my own team for organizing this session, and also to the participants who took the time to participate in this out of sheer curiosity or a real interest in including this region as part of your work. We're very grateful to you, and we look forward to hearing from you on how this session was helpful to your own work. Just a couple of last pieces, as we've been mentioning a number of times in the chat box, this research will be available online. In fact, the English version of the full report is already available online. We will also be sharing an abridged version. The presentation slides will also be available, as will the recording of this session. So please stay tuned. All of that will be available in both English and French on our website, and we'll be able to share that very shortly. So that will be it from all of us here at WUSC, from Expectation State and the Mastercard Foundation. Thank you so much for participating, and we wish you all a very pleasant day. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Ciao.
Yes.